leaders who don't listen will eventually be surrounded by people who've got nothing to say. Every single one of us can think of a decision that we made, and we did all the research, and we tried to force ourselves to be logical. We went against our intuition, against our gut. And then 6 months later, like, what have I done? I should have listened to my gut. I should have listened to my intuition.
We've got my own ideology and beliefs and value sets that play into that. And we've got this intuitive brain that just processes all of that like magic somewhere behind the screen and not subject to the rational mind's purview.
We are in two minds at any given moment about all sorts of things. I think at the core of it, we would rather feel right than be right as humans. Rather than trying to push harder to get people to change, just figure out where the handbrake is applied and why it's applied and release the handbrake. The backfire effect, which is sort of a somewhat contentious thing, because the backfire effect is a phenomenon you can't ignore. This idea that the harder you push with evidence and persuasion and logic, the more.
There is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing it all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of your comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation. Today we're talking about persuasion. So let me be really clear. Trying to persuade somebody to change their mind is, well, it's not for the faint of heart, and good luck with it at any rate. And some days it seems like it's absolutely, totally impossible, and maybe some days it is. But you could be trying to persuade someone that the path you've outlined is the best path forward, or that the change program is the right one for the company, or that the facts align with your view, or perhaps you're trying to persuade a friend or a family member something about current geopolitics. Well, we're going to stay focused on the business side of this equation, but the principles apply all the way around. So regardless of the circumstances, what we want to talk about is how can you more effectively get someone to change your mind, see your perspective, or adopt your plan. And my guest today has a fabulous book that I'm madly in love with called Mindstruck: Mastering the Art of Changing Minds. Michael McQueen is my guest. He's an award-winning speaker, change strategist, and best-selling author, 10 books no less, working with companies like Google, Toyota, MasterCard, been on stage with some amazing people, including Bill Gates, Mel Robinson, and Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple. Spoken to over 500,000 people across 5 continents since 2004. I love that one. And more importantly, his focus is helping people navigate uncertainty and stay ahead of the curve. Many, many more things we could say about you, Michael, but it's a delight to have you. Welcome to the conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. Lovely to spend some time.
Yes, indeed. And what a great topic. Who doesn't want to persuade somebody somewhere to change their mind? Now, of all the things you've done and talked about and written about, what got you interested in this topic of the challenge of changing people's minds?
Yeah, well, as you say, so this is book 10 for me. But the first five or six books for me were really squarely focused on the future, like what's coming down the line for all of us. And, talking about, for instance, AI, well before ChatGPT was a thing. I've been sort of focusing on that from a research perspective and in my client work for about 13 years, 14 years. So looking at sort of future trends has been my wheelhouse for a lot of years. And the conversation that I guess was the genesis moment for this research would have been, I'd say probably 8 or 9 years ago. So I was speaking at a conference. It was a big industry association event, and I was brought in to be like the keynote speaker before the lunch break. And I was given the brief, this industry is facing a whole lot of disruptions. Can you come in and give us a clear sense of what the next 3 to 5 years will probably be like from a technology, demographic, social trends, consumer expectations standpoint, and then how to get ready for those changes. So I'm like, cool, that's a standard brief for me. I still do a lot of that work. And so I remember speaking to a woman after I presented. So it was the lunch break, we're doing a book signing, and Helen was her name. She came up and introduced herself to me. And she said, I'm so with you. She said, I can see in my organization, her estimate was like 5 years before we are dead in the water. Like we are so dated, so stuck in our ways, so tradition bound. Like I can see all the things you're talking about. She said, my challenge is I cannot get, firstly, my team, but also my executives, my superiors, to realize, to wake up to what's in front of us. Like they're so rigid in their thinking. So have you got any ideas of how I can try and get through to them? So Now, like any communicator, when you don't know the answer to the question, what do you say? You ask a question of yourself. You say like, "Well, what have you already tried?" And because I'm like, I don't really know. That's not my area. It certainly wasn't at that point. And she told me all the things that sort of like the common sense things and the things that all the books tell you should do. So like, make the business case for change, the burning platform thing, give a whole lot of data, even appeal to the emotions, like the heartstrings, the motivational plea. None of it had worked. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. Like you've done all the things you should do and it hasn't worked. So why is that? And then what does work? So that was sort of the genesis moment of sort of then really digging into the last 10 to 15 years from a neuroscience and behavioral psychology standpoint, what's actually now working, particularly in an era where people are so skeptical and time poor, and things are changing so rapidly. There's that sense of fatigue or overwhelm with change. So therefore, the tactics that maybe worked 20 or 30 years ago don't work today. And so that really is really where I parked in terms of research, and then that's what went into this book.
Yeah, you're right about that. I think people are change fatigue. I think people, if I said on a podcast not too long ago, if I hear the word VUCA one more time, I may reach across and hit somebody. I got it. Okay. I'm living it. I'm living it like enough already. And it's not that there's change. It's how the heck do I cope with all the change that's coming? And it's not just the change, it's the volume of work and the feeling of the intensity of that volume of work. So anyway, yes, I think we're all with you on that one. And it's interesting you say the old tactics don't work. I'm doubtful that the old tactics ever worked. I think we might have been more compliant in prior years, decades than we might be at the moment, but that's debatable too, as well. Okay, so just a bit about the research. So you've gone back and looked at the neuroscience research. You've looked at the psychological research. Did you talk to leaders? Did you go and do some? Yeah, tell us a little bit about what you did beyond the traditional academic work.
Yeah, so a lot of it was, well, firstly, interviewing the people who are doing the research, so professors and researchers who are doing the stuff around what's going on in our brains, and some of the interesting studies that really have called into question what we've assumed we've known somewhat arrogantly for decades. Like, we've sort of like, we know how the brain works. And then the more we discover them, we're like, oh, actually, we sort of had some assumptions that maybe we need to change our own minds about how our minds work. So it's been interesting. The last 10 years has been a lot of that work done. So speaking to the people who've done that research has been fascinating. But also the people who've looked at not just the brain, but also that sort of mind, body, gut connection stuff. Like how many of the things that we feel certain about and sure about, not because of some cognitive process, but because like we just know that we know. Like there's what they call somatic knowledge, that it's in our gut. And even though that can sound a bit woo-woo, like the reality is it's so persuasive in terms of what makes up our minds. If someone goes, I just feel like this is the right thing to do. I can't logically tell you why that's a thing. So there's this idea that, you can't logic someone out of a position they didn't arrive at by logic. And yet we try and do that. Someone arrives at a position that just feels intuitively right for them because there's all sorts of other stuff happening in terms of the way their body's functioning. And then we sort of throw some peer review data at them and wonder why they're like, well, that doesn't really scratch the surface of why I feel like I do. And in fact, actually, the backfire effect, which is sort of a somewhat contentious thing, because the backfire effect is a phenomenon you can't ignore. This idea that the harder you push with evidence and persuasion and logic, the more it backfires. And, you've seen this with vaccine evidence where someone who's believed something about vaccines around the danger of vaccine, the more you show them evidence that actually indicates that maybe the thing that they read initially was flawed or biased, the more they double down on that belief. And so there's a lot of that research around that I think is just important to understand. So talking to those who've done that stuff, but also just on the ground day after day, I'm working with leaders who are grappling with this challenge of how do they bring their teams on the journey of change. And I think you're spot on. The idea that those sort of traditional tactics, I call it influence 1.0, which was like the Enlightenment era, logic, evidence, facts, reason. They probably never really worked, but I think people were perhaps more compliant. But the other key one is trusting. There was a base level of trust in experts, in scientists, in political leaders, in political establishments. And we've sort of fundamentally dismantled that in the last 25 years in a postmodern era to the point where there's no source of absolute truth now. And in the last probably 18 months, even more so, this idea of you can't trust anyone. And so if we can't even have a shared view of reality, that means the tactics that work in getting through to someone need to be very, very different.
You're totally right about that. I mean, we've seen fraud in science. We've seen misinformation in science. We've seen, oops, the data looked that way, but now on second consideration or considering some other factors, they don't look that way. I mean, we've seen all of those reasons for flip-flop, some just the nature of science in general, and some of them, well, with some other intentions behind them. But as a result, you do have to take a little bit of a jaded view of this new research thing that says X, Y, and Z. And in prior years, you would have brought in an expert, and the expert would have said, well, here's the answer. And provided the data was not hugely dated or flawed in some obvious way, people kind of went, oh, okay, I get it. Plus, we don't trust leaders as much as we used to in any capacity. In fact, I'm not
It's
sure
funny you
we do
mention
trust.
science. Like, yeah, the thing that always I flinched when I heard it during all the COVID years, and I fell into the trap myself at a few points where people would like post stuff online. I'm like, well, I'm going to trust the science on this. I'm like, but wait a minute, okay, we're going to step back from that. Science is not a static thing. It's a methodology, and it's a methodology requiring you to make a hypothesis, test that hypothesis, and update it if it's not correct, or if you find, evidence that counters your view. But we had this notion that science was an established thing that we could use to push people into thinking one way or another. I mean, I find it interesting too, and I'm not prone to conspiracy theory. I guess I'm just a very trusting person who assumes the best in others, which is probably naive, and maybe that's being an Australian. Like, I speak to friends who've grown up in countries where the government's been corrupt, and they have a fundamental distrust of institutions. As an Australian, we like, our country's well run, and so this idea I've got no reason to doubt the powers that be there out to get me. So I'm not really prone to conspiracy theory belief. But what's interesting, I noticed how many of the conspiracy theories, for instance, during COVID, around the origins of COVID, that many of us would have rolled our eyes and gone, how ridiculous that people are posting all these things about lab leaks, for instance. And now we're like, oh, actually, it would appear that maybe that was right. And what that does is it sows these seeds of doubt in all of our minds that, well, if I've been duped before because of the science or the experts or the realm of the intelligista, those who seem to know how things work, what else maybe am I being duped by? So that makes it very tricky, because what ground can you stand on that is solid? So that's a reality.
Well, there's also the question of, was anybody ever persuaded by the logic? I know one of the thesis of your book, so I want to get into that one. But I want to start with something slightly different. I want to give credit to, it sounds flawed that a senior leader would make a major decision on a direction of a company with tons of money behind it on what sounds like a hunch, a gut feel. I just believe this is right. And clearly there are examples where leaders make flawed decisions and the company suffers the consequences. But more times than not, that hunch is somehow right. So we kind of can't, I don't want to discredit that as somehow wrong. There's something to it. I don't think we understand what it is yet, but there's something to it. So let me come back. So we've been arguing, what I want to know is, why do people who are otherwise reasonably intelligent, perfectly capable of looking at the data, can make up their own minds, can see that what we thought one day is actually not true today, still won't change their minds? And we've been talking about the fact that we don't trust, and that maybe logic doesn't work, but unpack for me what is really going on here.
I think at the core of it, we would rather feel right than be right as humans. That idea of, if I feel like I'm right, that feels like solid ground. It feels safe. And like the feeling of knowing, which is sometimes what this is described as, the way we arrive at that can be, there's all sorts of on-ramps to that feeling of like, I've arrived at a point where I just know something is true. And if you look at what's happening in our brains, we'd like to think that, even the most logical amongst us are, really calm and rational and consider all the facts and have a really open mind. We'd all like to think that. And yet we also all know, if we're really honest with ourselves, there are some topics that when that comes up, like you feel like that bristling response, or like you're ready for a fight, you're ready for an argument. It's almost like something you don't want to hear the other side, you can't hear it. It is so offensive, so jarring, so confronting, so threatening. I mean, I love the name of your podcast is, out of the comfort zone, this idea that we are in our comfort zones neurologically all the time. What feels right feels safe and it feels comfortable. And our brains are very efficient at using energy. And so if we don't have to rethink, if we don't have to change our minds, that's actually really an efficient use of our brain's energy. So that's why we develop what are called heuristics or shortcuts, these rules of thumb that help us make sense of the world around us. Because I've seen something like that before, or I've read something like that before, or my tribe all thinks this. And so it's just easy to go to those rules of thumb. So if you look at what's actually happening in our brains when we are making decisions or thinking or considering, the two sort of main parts of our thinking apparatus, at least in terms of our brains, if you just leave the gut, the gay sort of brain-gut connection out of it for a moment. And Daniel Kahneman's work has looked at system 1, system 2 thinking, similar sort of ideas to that. What I talk about in the book is the idea we've got essentially two minds that we operate in. You sometimes hear that phrase that I'm of two minds or I'm in two minds about a decision I've got to make. And that's a tone of phrase, but it's actually fundamentally true. We are in two minds at any given moment about all sorts of things. So if you look at the two minds, the first one is what I call the inquiring mind. So the inquiring mind lives at the front of our brain, our prefrontal cortex. It is the logical, linear, rational, methodical, cautious part of our brain. The problem is it's also the most recent to develop from an evolutionary biology standpoint. It takes a lot of energy to use, a lot of self-control, discipline to force ourselves to step back, not respond emotionally, but really think about things. So if you look at some of the work from Zoe Chance, who's a professor at Yale, she would say that we only really use that inquiring mind, reasonable, rational, slow part of our brain for 5 to 10% of our thinking, which is not much. Like even really
That's
rational
really
people
incredible.
don't use that part of our brain anywhere as much as we'd like to think we do. So whereas most of our thinking happening, it's what I call the instinctive mind, which lives near the top of the brainstem. It's a group of brain functions often sort of loosely grouped together called the limbic system. And it's a part of our brain where things like our fight and flight reflexes live. It's where our tribal instincts tend to reside. It's where we process emotion. There's a degree of memory formation and coding that happens in that part of our brain as well. And so the reality is we do most of our thinking with that part of our brain because it is faster. Interestingly, because of where it's located in our brain, that's the bit that is connected to our gut as well. That's where the gut-brain connection really starts to come to the fore. And so it's reactive, it's fast. It jumps to conclusions, which is great because that's the part of our brain that's kept us alive as a species for millennia, because when a threat emerges, we jump to conclusions. It's fight or flight or flee or freeze. I mean, there's all different ways of slicing and dicing those instinctive responses. But if you just look at fight and flight, that's what it does really well. The interesting thing is, and what the research has shown around this, is that our instinctive minds don't just respond to physical threats with that reaction, they respond to psychological threats too. So if you expose me to an idea or an article or an Instagram post, something that threatens my sense of who I am, what I think is right, the way I've always seen this issue, what my comfort zone is, our brains have the same response. So we don't do fight and flight though, we'll do things like denial. We just like fingers in the ear, I just don't want to hear it. Or we get defensive. Or maybe we go on the attack. We do these things, we're not actually thinking because it's too confronting to have to unpick our beliefs and our assumptions and go against our tribe. Because, there's this notion that if I pull the thread on a belief, if I've got something that I think is true, and I pull that thread out and have to reconsider it, it's often referred to as the unraveling effect, which I think I learned from Adam Grant in his book, Think Again. This idea that if I pull that thread, what else is going to unravel? This idea of maybe I'm wrong about not just that, but this and this and this and this. That's very psychologically confronting. There's nothing comfortable about that. And so we just would rather just not engage. We'll just step back and just stay in our trenches and fight and, post back something scathing or, suggest that they should trust the science or whatever it is. We don't really engage properly with the issue.
I can see this so many times, so many places. I remember giving a family member a book about a topic I wanted the family member to read. It had nothing to do with politics, or I could have cared less about the particular politics, but they used a political example to make a point. They get to the political example, and the family member had such a nasty reaction. They threw the book in the trash can immediately and refused to have another conversation with it. And that wasn't even the point, so far as I was concerned. And I even responded to this according, no go, that's it, not going to touch it. And it's that level of emotionality we get around various issues. Now, that was a family member, that was around a political issue. But that happens all day long of the change in technology. No, we don't want this feature on the software. We want a different feature on the software. No, we want to speed this up. No, we want to use AI in the following ways. I mean, all the time when that fear is tapped, then off we go to the races. I suspect, so you get to tell me if I'm right or wrong, that there's also a thread, like you just said, it can unravel what I think is wrong. It can unravel my sense of identity, okay, which has even bigger consequences because I feel like I'm a safe member of this group, this tribe, this team. I fit in, I belong, it fits my sense of affiliation, it fits my sense of self, all those wonderful things. And if I really start to question seriously what other members in this group believe or espouse or are acting on, I question my identity in that group. And I think that may be more scary than the facts. Your thoughts?
100%. Because the concern is not that only do I question my identity in the group, but I might lose my spot in the group. I might be cancelled or exiled. And this is where things have gotten so tricky. And cancel culture, and it's not just in the sense of celebrities being cancelled, but this idea of if you speak up with a dissenting view, and you're part of like a community group or your team at work or a faith community, and even if you just raise a question, I'm just curious about X, Y, or Z. If that's seen as going against the orthodoxy, that can be very, very confronting. People can actually, even if they don't cancel you, that's that sense of, oh, we're just going to keep you at arm's length because you're not quite on the page with all of us. And so that's dangerous in all sorts of ways, because when you've got a culture like that in, for instance, an organization, people don't speak up. I remember Andy Stanley in a book years ago that I read, is a leadership expert based there in the States, and he said, leaders who don't listen will eventually be surrounded by people who've got nothing to say. And I just thought, that is just so profound.
Absolutely, totally. Well, we learn either I shut up and don't have anything to say if you won't listen, or I leave because I can't live without consequences. So, okay, fair enough. All right. So
yeah, that's huge. The tribal instincts are massive.
I think and we often discredit them and often say, no, 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 no. But I got to tell you, they are seriously alive and well in organizational life, in nonprofit life, in church life, in community life. I think it's part of our DNA. All right, but let's get off of that one, because I want to make sure I've captured this one in a good way. We've talked about the fact that there are two minds, what you call the instinctive and the inquiring mind. Inquiring mind is slow. It takes enormous number of calories to activate. It takes some discipline. It's hard to do. We rarely, particularly in the fast-paced world that we find ourselves in, take the energy to do that. And you've already quoted somebody as saying somewhere between maybe 5 to 10% of our time is in that inquiring mind. Instinctive mind is faster. It's more gut intuitive, literally and figuratively. It's the comfort zone. It's going along and getting along. It's got a whole bunch of components in that, and there are lots of reasons why that is an efficient system. Okay, for humans in a ton of ways. Okay, so you got these two. All right, now in your book, you describe a very interesting concept to me. You talk about identity, ideology, and intuition as really what's driving the instinctive mind. I know that this is a big section in the book, but can you kind of just steer us through that in sort of short order?
Yeah, well, and, in a way, this sort of puts language around even some of the themes we've been discussing. So this idea of, if people, something says it just resonated with me, or it struck a chord with me, like it's something that I feel like it's just right. And it's funny, like a chord often is 3 notes. And so I'm like, these are the 3 notes. So these are the 3 things that when you really, when you feel like something is absolutely right, typically it's because of these 3 things working in harmony together. So identity is that sense of tribal belonging. Who am I based on who I belong to? And I think one of the foundational questions we ask when we're considering an idea or some evidence or a piece of information or a worldview is, what do people like me think about ideas like this? And because we're looking, like, what are people in our tribe thinking? And then we defer often to them. So there's also that we're looking for the social proof or the tribal instincts, that sense of safety we get. Ideology tends to be about our beliefs, our foundational assumptions. And this idea that we said, feeling right feels good. So when we've got something that just feels like it's the right the right thing or the right way to view the world, that tends to be something that we sink into and we find a lot of comfort in. But the last one, the intuition one, is interesting because some of it's about brain and gut, but there's even sometimes a metaphysical aspect to intuition. This idea that you just know that you know. It's not even a gut thing. It's just this almost a spiritual acuity that you've got, that something is just right or not right. And I think to your point before, we'd be naive to dismiss that. I mean, every single one of us can think of a decision that we made, and we did all the research, and we tried to force ourselves to be logical. We went against our intuition, against our gut. We took the job, we bought the second-hand car, we entered the relationship, and deep down, all those things were like, this is not right, I shouldn't be doing this. But you had no logical reason why, so you ignored it. You bought the car, you went into the relationship, you took the job, and then 6 months later, like, what have I done? I should have listened to my gut. I should have listened to my intuition. And so intuition is the last piece of this, which is really significant, and we can't overlook that. Even though it's harder to quantify or measure, it has a huge impact on essentially what we think is right or what the right decision would be. So those three things together, that's really the domain of the instinctive mind. That's what our instinctive mind does really well, is defer to those three things.
And these sort of instincts or intuitions, can you say more about how they formed? Like, are they formed from experiences? Are they formed from the people that I'm around? Are they formed from habits? I mean, all of those contribute to what gives me this intuition, if you will.
Yeah. All of those things together make a big difference. I read a book. I'm going to see if I can see it here. See if I can reach and find this book, because it's a really good book looking at this very question. Like, how does intuition actually work? I have a pile of 30 books on my desk. I'm in research mode for the next book. So if I don't get it off, it'll collapse and go everywhere. Here, have a look. I'll find this book for you because I really liked this one. It's called The Intuition Toolkit by Joel. It's just honestly probably one of the most robust looks at how intuition works functionally. And what I like about Joel's work is he looks at when to trust or distrust our intuition. And so he talks a lot about what the domain you're in. Is it a domain that you've got experience in? Are the stakes high or low? I can't remember the specific metric. There was like 5 metric thing of just testing whether you should trust your intuition or not. But some of the examples he gave are very compelling around, our brains work so much faster and at such a more unconscious level than we're aware of. And so they pick up all these cues. You walk into a room and consciously you're like, I'm in the room, there are 5 people in the room, I can smell this, I can hear that, but they're like, that might be 10 active data inputs you've got about what's happening in the room. Deep down, you've got thousands of inputs that your brain is processing unconsciously, and that's often what's informing our intuition. You just get a vibe, something's not right here. I don't know what it is. And this is where, like in some professions, and I think I've done a lot of work in the healthcare sector over the years, and really great doctors, really great nurses use intuition constantly. Because they'll walk onto a ward, and there's a patient there, and they'll look at all the monitors and go, it all looks okay, but something just doesn't feel right about this patient. I don't know what it is, but we need to just check a few more things here. And often they'll find something that otherwise would have been missed except for intuition. So I think we'd be naive to look at that. And the fact that there's so much going on in the way we think that isn't just measurable with a functional MRI scan. Like, it's not just happening in the hardware of our brain. It is, sometimes what's called embodied cognition. You feel it in your body, it's heart, it's gut, it's in your bones almost. And so I think we'd be naive to overlook that. Even though it's tricky to quantify, it has a huge impact on the way we think.
All right, I'm smiling because in graduate school, studying neurology and, the complexities of the cortex and the visual cortex and all of that jazz. And, the limbic system, in those days, the limbic system was not well understood in human beings. And I remember saying, this was many decades ago, I won't say how many, but a few ago, I remember saying, one day we're going to find out that our cortex does nothing useful and that it's all driven by the limbic system. And here we are. I was right. Little did I know what I was saying at the time. Rather naive statement and a little bit of a joke, but all right, so fair enough. So if all of this is going on, all right, so we've got lack of trust in institutions in some places in the world. We've got the tribal sense, and what does my tribe think? And if my tribe doesn't agree with it, am I really going to go against that tribe? And how could they all be wrong? And, all that kind of second guessing. We've got the intuition. We've got my own ideology and beliefs and value sets that play into that. And we've got this intuitive brain that just processes all of that like magic somewhere behind the screen. and not subject to the rational mind's purview, I think is the simplest way I will say it. And fast allows us to reach a snap decision. And this is what you're dealing with when I'm trying to get somebody to change their mind. So with that as a context, Michael, how do I get people to change their minds? Please give us some tactics.
Well, I think the first thing is to look at what's causing the resistance. And Jonah Berger's book, The Catalyst, was a really good look at this because he said, rather than trying to push harder to get people to change, just figure out where the handbrake is applied and why it's applied and release the handbrake. And I think there's such wisdom in that. So rather than trying to change people's minds by crafting a better argument or a better approach, and you can do a lot of that, and we can talk about tactics for framing and using language that's really strategically, asking good questions. There's a lot that you can do actively, but also what can you do to address the things that are causing that stubbornness, the resistance, that sense of being mind stuck in the first place. And one of the things that stands out to me that really, when I started to look at the research, challenged me to shift my own thinking was this principle that I've written about for years in books, and we hear so often that you just assume it's a truism. Everyone knows it's the case. It must be right. Like this idea that humans are afraid of change. That's what we hear so often. It's just as humans, it's just part of our nature. We're afraid of change, which is not actually true. So if you look at what's actually going on in our brains when we resist change, when we don't want to change either the way we're doing things or change our mind, it's not the fear of the change, it's the fear of loss. It's what we lose in the process of change. That's what we're afraid of. And so rather than trying to upsell the benefits of change, it would be better to lessen the loss. And so there's a whole chapter in the book, like that's the title of the chapter, is how do you lessen the loss? Because if we can do that, the battle's half won in terms of getting people to change their minds. So the three losses that stand out to me that I think are most correlated with stubbornness or resistance to change, first would be a loss of dignity, the idea that I might lose face, I might be embarrassed. I might be shamed if I'm shown to be wrong, or if I have to admit that I'm wrong. And this idea of how do you get people to a point where they can admit they might have been wrong without having to admit they were an idiot in order to believe what they did. And so often we back people into that corner. So the loss of dignity is a big one. The loss of power, this idea that I had power, and if you ask me to change, I might lose some of the power I had. But the other one's a loss of certainty. This idea that I know this, and if you ask me to change to something else, I don't know that. That's unfamiliar. And our brains will often favor unhappiness over uncertainty, which is probably like an important point to even just park on for a moment for some of your listeners. This is probably like the thing they need to hear because, as humans, we will stay in roles, ways of doing things, even relationships that suck, that are toxic, that are not serving us, that are not good, but the devil you know is better than the one you don't. So you stay in something that is not great, but it's like the fear of uncertainty is so significant, you'll stick with what you know. And so bearing in mind these three fears, it's like, how do you lessen those fears in order to make people feel at least open or safe enough to change? And I saw this dynamic play out recently. I was working with a colleague who's the CEO of a big retail brand. And so I'd spoken to her probably 18 months ago. She was so excited because they had spent 2 years building this amazing back-end system for all their sales team. And like their previous back-end system was like built in the 90s. It was like almost DOS based. It was so clunky, didn't integrate with any social media platforms. They couldn't do any like real-time pricing or dynamic pricing or coupons on Instagram. And their business is a big Instagram business. So they'd spent all this money to develop this amazing new system, fully integrated with social media, on phones, all the rest. And so I saw her a few months ago and I said, how's the rollout gone? Expecting her to be like, it's been unreal. You should see how it's changed our business. And her whole tone was so different to what I expected. She was like discouraged would probably be the best word, like crestfallen. And I said, well, what's happened? And she said, we have had so much pushback. We've got people who've resigned. Like they've just left the company. Like, I hate the new system. We've got like petitions going around asking us to go back to the old one. I'm like, this is the system they all hated, but now they want to go back to it. And so she said, I was amazed at how afraid of change our people were. And so then I said, well, maybe it's not the change. What are the losses involved? And it was all three of them. Loss of power. I knew how to do things in the past. I had that sense of status. And you've asked me to do something that I don't feel powerful. I don't feel knowledgeable. I feel embarrassed because I don't know how to do things. The loss of dignity and the loss of certainty was involved hugely. So it's identifying before you try and get people to change, accounting for, trying to figure out what those losses might be and being proactive in lessening them.
Yeah. I often say before you make the change, I don't care if it's rationally brilliant, You just change what it means I have to do my job. I knew who to call yesterday. I don't know who to call today. I knew what it was going to take to get a problem fixed. I don't know what it's going to take today. I mean, if you just start racking up what I now don't know how to do, it's huge. And most people would say, I'll go back to the old because at least I knew how it worked.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, same idea. So how do you tackle then these fears?
I mean, it's tricky because it depends on the context and depends how much trust is there to start with. So trust is a big element here because you can say that it's not going to be a loss or it's not going to cost you, but if people don't trust you, it doesn't really matter. So I think the first principle is how do you make the change feel like a gentle improvement on the past rather than a break from the past? And I think there's a real art to doing this. And like I look at, for instance, like 17th century inventor James Watt, like brilliant. When he'd invented the steam turbine engine, he knew, just like we're seeing the resistance to AI today, like AI is a threat, it's going to take all the jobs, it's going to fundamentally change society and devalue what we bring to the equation as humans. Same thing happening with the steam turbine engine. And so when he invented it, he described its power in a frame that made sense to people. He talked about it in terms of horsepower. And this idea, oh, we know what a horse does, we know how powerful a horse is. If this is 10 horsepower, even though it's a little bit uncertain, at least I've got a frame for understanding it. So it was an improvement on the past. So even like taking, for instance, change in a team or organizational context, how do you keep the same names for projects or team leaders or structures, or keep some things in place, change around them, but try and keep the appearance or the sense of familiarity with the past? And that can make a huge difference. But I think also giving people a process, the choice in the process of the change, like involve people early. Even if you've like figured out exactly what we need to do and when it's going to happen, at the front end of the process, involve people in getting their input. And if they think it was their idea, that idea of like, okay, you've asked me for my input on how we should change, they'll probably suggest the very thing that you've already thought was probably the plan. But because they've been invested in it, they feel a part of it, it's their idea, that loss of dignity is no longer there because it was their idea. And so just involving people in the process along the way makes a huge difference as well.
Right. Even if it's just the back end of the process, I've seen change work more effectively because we involve people in saying, well, look, this is going to happen. But now, what do you want to call it? What do you want the names of the rooms to be in a new office building? You know, let's have a process there. What colors do you want? Like, those are not the big decisions of how it is we're going to work, but the fact that people were involved and had some say gives them a degree of agency, and that solves so much of the loss as well.
Yes, it does, absolutely.
Okay. And I often talk about, for those who know what I say about this one, I often talk about the need to ring fence some things, because you can't change everything. You've got to put a fence around things that you're going to kind of leave the same. Even if you know 3 years from now I'm going to change it, at least for now, ring fence it so people can go, ah, all right, that part isn't changing. Anyway, that's my view. I'm not the expert here.
That's good. Really
all
good.
right. So we have to recognize that the intuitive mind is in control. The intuitive mind is driven by the identity, ideology, and intuition. Those things are real. It's the fear of loss, not the fear of change, that is really driving behavior. And I want to minimize the loss. I want to emphasize the gain in some ways. To pick up Kahneman and Tversky, some original research there, and talk about keeping it similar in ways to what we have in the past. Okay, that lessens the fear of the change. All right. What else do I do to change someone's mind?
I think one of the big things for a leader that can be really helpful is the posture that you approach the conversation with. And what I would suggest is if you're trying to excel an idea or a point of view, unsell it, don't upsell it. In other words, go in and suggest the idea and say, look, I may be way off here. I might be completely wrong. My sense is that, ... You share the perspective, the idea, what you're wanting them to consider. Because there is something that happens where, and we all know this, when you're speaking with someone and they present a well-formed, fully formed, robust argument, what's our instinctive reaction? And our instinctive mind will do this, push back. Look for all the holes, the reasons why you might not be right. By approaching it with that sense of openness and humility, like I'm just suggesting something here. I might not be right. I might not be. I'm often wrong with this stuff, but I'm just curious. What's? In fact, can you give me your reflections on this? It invites them into a conversation, and it's Now, and posture is probably the right word, because you think if you're having a conversation with someone, if you lean in, what are they naturally wanting to do? Lean out, like push back, like get resistant or defensive. And by simply, you almost leaning back, they want to lean forward. And so it's about the posture you use. So I think even just using that sort of language of unselling rather than upselling. And from a sales perspective, I find this amazing how often it works. You don't want to be manipulative with this stuff. And there's an important distinction there, like between persuasion and manipulation. But like a number of times, and like my core work is conference speaking. So we've got an office in New York, one in Sydney. So I go between here and there a lot for conferences. And one of the parts of the sales process for conferences is the pre-briefing call. So our clients, like we've got 4 speakers we're choosing from. When I jump on a call with each of you, just essentially get your pitch. And so, normally one of the speaker agencies or the speaker bureaus has put you forward. They've shared some details already. And what I used to think is it was like dance monkey dance time. It's like you're on the call, you've got 10 minutes, you've got a committee of 7 people who are all sitting there with their arms folded, and you have to give them your best stuff, really compelling. What I found a few years ago is the best thing I could do is if it wasn't the right fit exactly for me, like every now and again you get an inquiry like, I can do that, but it's probably not really my wheelhouse. I can think of maybe a few other colleagues that might be a better fit. I would actually lead with that. And I would unsell myself. And so I'd say, look, thanks for the chance to be a part of the process. I'm not certain that if I am right for you. And what I'd noticed, and it's 9 times out of 10, the tables turn. And they start selling you. And I don't know, we really, really do think you'd be great. And here's why. And like the arms unfold and they're now trying to get you involved. It's like changing the whole posture. When you go in trying to sell, everyone gets defensive. When you go in just open and humble and unsell it, the difference is amazing. So I think that can make a huge difference for leaders or salespeople trying to get someone on board is just to approach it with that sense of openness and humility. And it invites people into a conversation rather than feeling like they need to be defensive.
I think you said use this word several times, but in my experience in human relationships, anything I'm trying to get somebody to do is ultimately a piece of persuasion, I think. And this notion of defensiveness, if I can get people's defensiveness to stay down, we've got a shot at getting someplace good. But the moment that defensive wall comes up, forget it. They're digging in, I'm digging in, they're pressing harder, I'm pressing harder. They're not listening, I'm trying. I mean, like there's just nothing happening when the defenses kick in. But the magic is not getting those defenses kicked in. So these tactics are really, in some ways, lowering the defenses. I might not be right. Oh, well, let's think about that. Or I'm not sure I'm the right person for you. Oh, wait, hold on. Or my favorite one, what's the problem you're really trying to solve here? Because then I get to use your language to tell you what it is that you said you wanted, and then we're off to the... But it's another way of just lowering defenses is what we're talking about. Okay, talk to me for a minute about this concept called priming.
Yeah, so priming is essentially setting someone up to be open. And so some of it, like the language of upselling and unselling, that's a really good example of priming. So this idea of like, I may be way off here, the difference that can make is really huge. I think the other thing about priming that's interesting that I found fascinating from the research is that you would assume that the most persuasive thing you can do is put your best foot forward, lead with your best arguments, all the data that's making your case. And the opposite is often true. So Kip Williams, who's a social psychologist, looked at this in a legal context. And he looked at when were the times where in legal proceedings the jury began to favour one side's argument over another. And what he found is that the moment the jury began to favour one side's argument over another was when that one of the solicitors or one of the lawyers brought to the jury evidence that worked against their own case. The key was you had to bring it up before the opposing side could. Because what that did, firstly, is it made you seem open and reasonable and honest because I'm sharing not just our side, but both sides of the argument here. But what it also did is it diffused some of that defensiveness, and it was a great priming technique for diffusing defensiveness because, again, as humans, the jury sitting there, if all they hear is all the arguments in your favour, what are they automatically thinking? What are you not telling me? What's the other side of this argument? They're looking to pick holes in your perspective. By you going with the negative stuff from the outset, it's like you neutralize it, you just bring it out to the light and suddenly it's not a big deal. And it shows that that it's not cut and dried. There's areas of nuance and grey here and that you're aware of that. And it shows you to be a fair a fair party in the discussion. So that was something that I thought was really helpful as a primary technique, is to be incredibly open. That level of authenticity makes a huge difference, I think, in most relationships, because if there is a lack of trust, showing yourself to be vulnerable, self-deprecating, self-disclosure, these will make a huge difference.
Isn't it? I mean, so how many people have said this in terms of various pieces of research? I see it every day. I promise you this notion of being vulnerable is going to work for you. But 99% of the time, your instinct, if you will, in presenting to a senior executive is, oh no, I have to be 100% confident. I have to push. I have to get up and shout and say and whatever. And that's what we do. We like, I can't admit, or a senior executive saying, I can't say that I think this might be wrong or I'm uncertain. Can't do it. Yet it has massive positive benefits when you do. So, all right, Michael, there's about 15 other things here that we could talk about. So the whole notion of how you deal with disagreement, how do you deal with congruence and discongruence, language, a thing you call the power of they. I highly recommend people look in that one. But I think what I'm going to say at this point is what a fascinating conversation, what a great book, and highly recommend people dig in a little bit deeper because there are gems buried in just about every other page of this book. So my guest today, Michael McQueen, the book is called Mind Struck, Mastering the Art of Changing Minds. I think my highlight on this one is this whole notion about beginning to be able to recognize what someone else is resisting, what their fear of loss is, how that's kicking in their own defensive responses, and then getting smart about lowering those defenses. One of those being admit what might not be perfect about your own case in advance of somebody else calling it out. So cool. Michael, thank you very much. What a great conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And join us next week for another episode in Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone.